Welcome to the Peachtree Podcast. Peachtree Learning Center is a nonprofit in Middle Tennessee dedicated to training and discipling students in all the fine arts to become excellent and skilled in order to spread the kingdom of God into the world of the arts. On this podcast, we will discuss topics designed to encourage, uplift, educate, and equip people to proclaim the kingdom more deeply in their own families and communities. Once again, we're here with a podcast from Peachtree Learning Center, and today we're going to talk a little more about stories and how they can shape our lives. We've delved into this just a little bit on a few episodes back and talked a little bit about the power of story. That's the theme at Peachtree this year that's kind of informed a lot of our choices for class materials and class shapes. And we're going to delve into that a little bit more as this year is getting deeper. We wanted to discuss just how powerful stories are and even talk specifically about the kinds of stories and mention some books that have been very helpful in shaping people and informing children and growing them. So I wanted to mention at the beginning that C.S. Lewis has a great essay called On Stories, and it's actually part of a volume on my shelf that has a whole collection of essays that he wrote about stories and storytelling, how important handing down culture is through those types of media. And one of my favorite quotes was in a part of that first essay. He talked about how good stories are good for all ages. And he said, no book is really worth reading at the age of 10, which is not equally and often far more worth reading at the age of 50. He goes on to say, the only imaginative works we ought to grow out of are those which it should have been better not to have read at all. In terms of food, think about it like this. A mature person might grow into loving spinach or Brussels sprouts or kale, but that doesn't mean they should stop eating bread and butter. Another quote of his said, he said, a children's story which is only enjoyed by children is a bad children's story. And that's really my favorite because the heart of the matter is children are human. They're people. They're fully formed people. They have not matured in every way, but everything inside them will come to bear and produce a whole person. And acting like they're some kind of stunted form of humanity is disrespectful. So when we read them stories or when we allow them to participate in things that we think are childish or only for children, we're really disrespecting the humanity that's locked inside. And the heart of the matter is each of us has only a finite amount of time to influence children and to shape them and help them shape their character. And why waste time of theirs on things that won't last? Being silly all the time and making that a habit is not something that helps them. Childhood is innocent, but it is not silly. If the stories that they're taking in aren't helping them in some way, then it's a waste of time. If the things that they spend their time on are just frivolous, it is disrespectful to their time. Think about it in terms of the long game. If they spend 18 to 20 years with you under your roof, that is a fourth or more of their expected lifespan. And that needs to be time that is used wisely. One quote that I heard when I was young and had horses was about training a horse. And this trainer said, at every session that you spend with a horse, you either help or you harm the horse. There is no neutral time. And that really stuck with me. And as a mom, I remembered that quote and I thought, well, how much more true is that as a parent for my child? If every day I spend is, if I think it's neutral, I'm kidding myself that I've either helped that person or I've harmed that person. That means that not settling for pop culture's offerings is an important tool. And I do not say that it's not okay to be silly. I'm not trying to say that you have to have some kind of purpose or learning at every moment. But I'm just saying, even in your time that is leisure time, being able to find things that are fun to do and character shaping are really good and important. So I wanted to just illustrate this with some books that we have a lot of examples on our Peachtree shelf, and there are a lot of books that we've kind of gathered over the years from people that we walked alongside, some authors that I know are very purposeful with picture books are people like Tommy DePaola, Lewis Ellert, Eric Carle, Patricia McKissick, Beatrix Potter, the Brambley Hedge books by Jill Barklam, Maurice Sendak and his Little Bear series. All of those people wrote books, and they're actually mostly picture books that show something about humanity, illustrate principles at work, give stories that are creative and thoughtful, give illustrations of beauty. Ruth Heller has a beautiful series of gorgeously illustrated books that are all about parts of speech and how words work. And they're just beautiful, and they're so appealing because the pictures are so beautiful. When you think about picture books that illustrate fun things or creative things, go to Dr. Seuss, go to Henry and Mudge series or Cynthia Rylant books, or you go to folk tales that are illustrated creatively. Stephen Kellogg has a great series of books. All of his books are so fun to look at, and he has stories about Yankee Doodle and Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill and all these creative ways of passing down folk tales. There are tons of good picture books about historical events and people. Keep the Lights Burning Abbey is the true story of a little girl who ran a lighthouse all by herself. Jean Fritz has a whole series of books about everybody from Napoleon to James Madison. The story of Balto, the dog who saved a village by taking medicine in. Paul Revere's Ride. There's a book about young Harriet Tubman called Minty. That's just a beautiful book. John Ronald's Dragons is a pretty recent title that speaks about J.R.R. Tolkien's childhood. One of my favorites was The Librarian Who Measured the World, and it's an old story about a Greek librarian who lived in the 200s BC. His name is Eratosthenes, and he actually figured out how to calculate the circumference of the Earth by using the sun and a hole in the ground. It's a fascinating story, but it's told so well in a picture book that your students don't have to roll their eyes and think this is a boring piece of history. They just get involved in the story because of the way it's told. We had picture books at our house about building the Erie Canal and the Brooklyn Bridge. We had books about the Pony Express and covered wagon trips, how cathedrals were built. We learned geography from books like How to Make an Apple Pie and See the World, or How to Make a Cherry Pie and See the USA, and then we would go make the pie. There are such fun ways to involve children in stories. There's a great book called Scrambled States of America that anthropomorphizes states and makes them like people, and they are trying to choose how they're going to live together, and they end up misshaping the United States and making it all out of whack, and then they go back at the end, of course, and figure out that they had it wrong, and they want to go back and put themselves in the right place. And then we found a card game that was based on that story, and so we learned a lot about the geography of the United States just from reading this picture book. There's also a great host of books that just help you inspire your children and also contextualize your world. There are picture books and early readers about the writing of our national anthem. There's a great one about the candy bombers who dropped chocolates over Germany after World War II had officially ended because they were trying to bring up the morale of the German children and the German families. We had a great one about the preamble of our Constitution. There's a fantastic woodcut illustrated book about the Christmas Eve reprieve in the trenches in World War I called Truce. There were great picture biographies of Abe Lincoln, Amelia Earhart, Jim Elliot, Alexander Graham Bell, the Wright brothers. I could just go on and on. If you dig and you look and you seek and you knock, there are so many great versions of stories that just inspire and inform and it really transform students into people who can think and who understand the world, and they can get all these things tucked away before they ever really can read on their own because you found good books that illustrate those things. If we only feed children silly side, for example, how will they ever grow into sober-minded adults? We've been told that being silly continually with our children somehow identifies with them on a deep level, but I really believe it's just disrespectful to let them entertain themselves continually or to act like childhood is a time period just made for them to be wasteful. I'm all in for a good pillow fight. Pouring vinegar in a hole in the ground and adding baking soda and making a volcano, that's just great fun. Or going around barefoot outside to splash in mud puddles and make mud pies. But those are creative pursuits. They're not just silly mindlessness. Amusement, as we've talked about before, is the process of letting thought go. And amusement are things that produce no conscious thoughts. And our world is full of those kinds of distractions. Have you read anything recently about video games and the effect they have on children's brains? It's scary stuff out there, and it's a scary world. But instead of letting children imbibe these kinds of things mindlessly, be purposeful and go out and find great stories told well with good illustrations. It seems that our modern world has really brought childhood and childish thoughts into adulthood. Instead of encouraging children to grow up into adulthood, we've actually brought childhood with them as they grow up. And that's contrary to what we're told by the Lord. Paul told us in 1 Corinthians 13, when I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. This observation comes at the end of the chapter that tells us how to love well. And the juxtaposition of those two principles is not lost on me. I read how to love well. Love is patient, love is kind. That whole chapter is about how to love well. And then he comes to the end of that description and he says, when I was a child, I thought like a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things and I started to think like a man. And that means you love well. And that also means you quit acting silly. Loving well also can mean helping our children to understand the world they're in, to be innocent, but also to be wise. Jesus told his followers in Matthew 10 that he was sending them out as sheep among wolves. Has this ever been more true of a family? Have you ever seen a time period, or do you know of a time period in history when it's been more true that you are trying to raise sheep to go out among wolves? And what's his next comment? Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. This is not letting your children waste their childhood and then at some point throwing adult-themed material at them and expecting them to grow discernment about it. This means guiding them into understanding what is good and true. It means cutting their teeth on things that are excellent and pure and holy and good for them, and then letting them go. And they will be innocent as doves, but also wise as serpents. Part of our job is to ground our children in humanity's story and tell them how people have lived well over time and how the world has worked and how inventions have come along with mankind's abilities from God to make life easier and better. Reading older books and hearing from cultures hundreds of years before ours gives them context, and knowing everyone everywhere has historically had to go get water outside their own house is very important. It allows us to be grateful for the fact that we turn on a faucet and water comes straight out. This is the kind of thing that allows us to be deeper individuals. When we hear how people have lived and the stories they've told and the music they've played and the houses they've built, when we examine other cultures and hear how they have used the tools at their disposal to be creative and inventive and found ways to be joyful in the face of scarcity even, it helps our children to think beautiful thoughts about other cultures, and it also helps them to be able to understand what living is all about. It keeps them from being surface dwellers and lets them dive deep into what God has for them as humans. So I really want to deeply encourage you to evaluate stories as they come into your home, evaluate the things that your children spend their time on, and help them to learn to spend that time wisely, making the most of it and redeeming the time, for the days are evil. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope you have a blessed day. Thank you so much for joining us today. To support this podcast, please go follow us on your podcast platform of choice. And if you're interested in knowing more about the work of Peachtree, please go visit our website at peachtreelearningcenter.com for more information.